Hello and welcome to another episode of Aviation Book Club. I am curator Brian McFarland. This is the Army branch historian Billy Crosby, my counterpart in life. So, Billy, where are we?
Well, today we are reviewing Sean Naylor's Not a Good Day to Die. We'll be spending some time discussing this volume. It is, as it indicates on the cover, a national bestseller. We'll talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the volume and what questions it leaves us with and how it's applicable to our study of broader Army aviation history. Before we begin, though, I'd like to remind you, although it might seem improbable, we are actually U.S. government employees. We are now, though, speaking in a capacity outside of our employment. The opinions that we express here are not indicative of U.S. government policy, are not the opinions of the Army Aviation Center of Excellence, or of any other entity in DoD. They are simply our own opinions. This is simply two nerds talking about things that they enjoy reading. Do not read anything else into this. So with that, let's begin our discussion of the volume for this month, Not a Good Day to Die, by Sean Naylor. I'd like to pitch it back over to Brian for an initial discussion on who Sean Naylor is and why he might have some insight into the topic of Operation Anaconda.
So, yeah, thanks, Billy. Sean Naylor is a journalist, right? And some people may question why perhaps a journalist's perspective lands as something that we want to treat as a history, right? Well, not only do journalists typically are they the first ones to the scene of reporting on any event in history, right? So it's the sort of first draft history. But Sean Naylor was also fortunate enough to be on the ground as one of the embedded media reporters reporting on this event in the days. Now, he used those sort of links with people that he had been there with to gain some insights, gain some trust, and use that to write about a lot of these events inside the book. Now, one thing that a journalist does very well is write so that people can really get into the meat of the material, right? But I'd like to pass it over to Billy here and talk about maybe what a journalist doesn't do well as a historian.
Right. So what a journalist does very well is put you on the scene. And this volume does that. You get a real sense of the emotion, the excitement. You oftentimes can feel like you're there. The bullets are flying over your head as you're reading this. And that's great. But since most of what he gets comes from the participants on the ground, a great way to get some insight on this. He is trying to convey that emotion. So what he's giving you is really a raw sort of dump of everything that was involved. Because, as he even stipulates, some of the various commands that he's writing about refused to answer his questions or didn't want to have anything to do with it. Oftentimes wouldn't make available some of those senior leaders. He has to fill in some of those gaps. Because he wrote this so close to the events, it was raw and emotional for those involved, some who were still wearing the uniform and didn't feel free to discuss it. He also did not have as much of the documentary evidence to back up what he was talking about. Some of it's in there, but what a historian would do is not try and refute the claims made by the participants, but by looking at the documentary record, provide evidence that either supports, casts in a different light, or maybe questions some of what the people who were involved see. What historians oftentimes see is when they talk to a participant who's involved, is they get that one myopic view. They're overwhelmed by the emotions. Now, some of you might be saying, well, what if they're talking to a commander who has very good situational awareness? They have unmanned footage. They're talking to the participant on the ground. They have the luxury of numerous sensory feeds, giving them various views about them. That said, it is still only one view. And Naylor sometimes leaves you with a little bit of tunnel vision. And this is something that journalists do. They have to, because of their code of ethics, stick with the source who's willing to come on the record. And that source offers theirs. In Naylor's defense, he oftentimes says he wants to get to the counterpoint, but he simply can't find it. Now, this does lead us to another sort of concern, and this is something that we see in an effort to get this out quickly, because he wants to let Americans know what's going on, he's talking to those participants on one side of the battle.
Correct.
Absent from this account are any discussions from the other side. You won't hear an Uzbek or a Chechen fighter's view on this, any of the members of the Taliban, or any of those Al-Qaeda terrorists. Now, for those of you at home wondering, how would Mr. Naylor track down an internationally wanted terrorist? Absolutely, it's a daunting task. And I'm not saying that historians would find this any less challenging or that they would be able to do it. All I'm simply saying is that with the benefit of time, documentary evidence might arise. Some of those fighters might have shared some of their stories with other people, and those things would come out. And thanks to diligent research, a good historian might be able to show the counterpoint view, whether it is the view from the enemy or the view from the other officer in that same foxhole who was making a decision that maybe the participant he interviewed didn't agree with. So that's one of the things that, as we look at this volume and look at what a journalist offers us, we have to sort of keep in mind that maybe there's some additional work to do, and maybe we need to cross-reference things. But that said, Naylor does a pretty good job of giving really the background for what would lead to Operation Anaconda, as well as the conduct of the operation, and then some of the fallout. He really does that fairly well. So Brian, could you walk us through how he takes us through the volume?
Yeah, Naylor constructs the volume effectively in 3 sections, as Billy referenced here. Now, some of that leads to the reader getting a very, very good grasp of who these people are, what their preparations are, and what their emotions are going into these events. However, because you're talking about a large number of units from disparate commands all over that are sort of ad hoc placed together, it gets very hard to understand, which is a very decent point. It gets very hard to understand who's actually doing what at any real time. Who's contributing what? Who is the powerful force? One of the points that Naylor brings up here is that was a point of contention on the battlefield during Operation Anaconda. No one really knew who was in charge, who really was the primary force on the ground, who everyone was there to support. Instead, you had a lot of groups of people that could maybe physically see one another, maybe just be able to communicate with one another, but really weren't sure of what anyone else on the battlefield was doing at any particular time. Some of that has to do with the technologies of the day. Some of that has to do with the ways that we build an army to fight. Naylor highlights in the second portion of the book really the battle, the strong effects of the battle. Now, in so doing, he does a great job of establishing a timeline, and a timeline that works given a vast number of players. They feeding in, feeding out. He does a great job of maintaining a tether through all of these players and all these actors. Finally, in the third section, he really does talk about just the fallout from this event, what the after effects of this horrible event were. Now, for this typical history, Naylor very early on would have established some sort of argument and then laid out his pieces of this history that supported or maybe refuted that argument. But Naylor didn't do that.
Yeah, he's really sort of immersed in the chronology and then simply telling the story, right? This is what happened, this is what we saw, and this is what the participants were feeling at that moment. It's great in a very raw sense. And while his structure is to roughly follow the chronology, he brings the reader along as you experience the battle. What is sometimes, I think, left behind is a sense of how it's all connected. And what can you make of it? And that's something that maybe a historian would offer, is a way to connect these disparate actions and people and let people see, oh, this is how that kind of connects. These were the actions and reactions and counter moves made by each one of the entities as they're there operating in the battlefield. He sidesteps some of the argumentation at the beginning right? He's not saying this is how this should be interpreted,
Right.
or here's what we can extract from our study of these events. But he does offer some arguments later on. And this is what separates him from the work of a historian. The historian would tell you up front, I've looked at this event, I'm going to tell you about it. Here's what I think is the most important or the most contentious or the most valuable thing. And I'm going to highlight everything about it and show you that. And that's really the work that a historian does. Naylor offers a little of that, but it's more near the end of the book. And it's worth reading this section just so we can get clear. He's talking about one of the participants there, and this participant is wondering as he looks at the battlefield, right? He's been there for a half hour. There hadn't been any aircraft. And as Naylor writes, the participant asks, where the hell is our closed air support? He wonders. This is what the participant says. And then Naylor shifts to another paragraph and he says, where the hell indeed? No issue to emerge from Operation Anaconda has generated more heat and less light than the question of why the air power upon which Task Force Rockeson troops were forced to rely for indirect fire did not deliver the results they expected. Here, Naylor is making an argument. He is saying that this is the most contentious issue, not the cross communications, not the conflicting leadership concerns, not the seeming lack of unity of command, not the inability to establish support and supporting relationship, who gets the support, who provides it, all of that. Even though he highlights all that here, all the participants say, we thought we were the main effort,
Right.
but we didn't get the support we wanted. He says it, but he doesn't say that's the most contentious issue. He says the most contentious issue is, where was this air power?
So
Now, that's an argument.
that's an argument. That's a wonderful argument. And one thing to highlight in this, to make clear for everyone here watching at home, is that the Rockesons, a ground brigade out of the 101st, were not able to bring organic fires with them, right? So he's talking, they were having to rely on air support for their indirect fires. Billy, you kind of come from a very informed background on this. So I'd like you to, if you could, sort of talk us through what that relationship looks like typically, and then kind of what it would mean to a ground force commander to not have organic fires.
Yeah. So what Naylor talks about a little bit, and what I think starts to feed his argument, although he's not as explicit about it as maybe it could be, is that the large ground unit deployed, this task force from the 101st, went so bereft of a lot of the assets it would normally take to the fight. Some of that in forms of its own organic or organic, I don't mean carbon-based, I mean attached to the unit and essentially the property of the commander, okay? Apaches, it didn't take all of them. And it didn't take some of the other big cannons and things like that that it normally would have had. On the day of the execution of the operation, a number of the commanders involved didn't take with them the heavy mortars they normally would have had. During the initial insert, there was one 120 millimeter mortar that gets there, and they quickly run out of ammo for it. They had anticipated heavy usage for it. They did this not because they were not thinking ahead or not anticipating a heavy fight. They did it because they were promised air support to make up for the firepower they didn't bring. So these units typically have this, what we call organic, but part of their own organization's firepower. Instead of bringing that, they brought more infantrymen with them. The limiting factor here being how many people they could get on board the aircraft, because these aircraft were required to fly in that situation. With a limited number of seats, they couldn't give up seats for more ammunition for a big mortar or a seat for the mortar itself. By putting more soldiers on the ground, they're able to maneuver a little more with less firepower. The idea being that firepower was going to be made up, or the deficiency from not having their own firepower, by air support. But as Naylor shows, the air support doesn't materialize in the manner they expect. And it doesn't materialize that way for a number of reasons. He traces some of the command and control reasons, some of the misinterpretation reasons, some of the things that they're talking about planning that everyone thinks are cemented or written down, or this is the way it's going to be, don't pan out on the day of the battle. He comments on Clausewitz, right? Talking about friction and fog of war. And it wasn't fog of war necessarily. They actually went to the battle with a misinterpretation at some various levels about the plan. That misinterpretation included who got the support, where it was going to be required, and how much was going to be delivered. So Naylor traces that. I wish that he'd gone with his argument up front. He really could have done everybody a favor by highlighting, look, I'm going to contend this is what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the volume. I would like you as the reader to pay attention to everyone who says they expected air support but didn't receive it.
Right.
And then look at the decisions that were made by these leaders who were expecting one kind of support but didn't receive it. And then what were the ramifications and the battlefield for it? That's kind of the way a historian would do it, setting the reader up to, hey, look, we're going to talk about this stuff, and here's what I think you should be really focused on. Naylor's like, just take a look at it. Misses things.
You know, journalists do that too with a headline typically,
Yeah.
right? There's something that's drawing you in.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that we're picking on Naylor for being a journalist and not a historian.
No.
But in this regard, there was a lot that could have been ascertained by the reader in that first reading with that argument up front.
Yeah.
Another aspect that Naylor talks about, but sort of glosses over, is the fact that these mountain areas that they were operating, that these aircraft were expected to fly over, through, and in, were exceptionally small.
Yeah.
The air was exceptionally cold, and these machines were never built to do those tasks.
Right.
Really fundamentally, the machines that the Army went to war with in 2001, 2003 was really built still along the concept of Cold War Europe.
Yeah.
So think about some of the limiting factors that these people are going into this conflict with. Yet another point here that could have come up, but really didn't, was that you have a large number of people who are making a huge operation happen with equipment that's sort of not intended for that environment, which is really the task given to any soldiers. Given this setup, how do you do the very best you can with what you have to offer? Unfortunately, the understanding was we show up with special forces and aircraft, and we can make any problem go away. Really, this motif starts establishing itself as early as the Gulf War in the 1990s, and then really begins to trend forward, right? Billy made the argument earlier today that really could be traced back to 1965.
Yeah. That's the X-ray.
However, one of the comments, the Rakistan leadership there was that they had to do an air assault. They had to, because it would provide the psychological effect of taking the enemy off their footing. But Billy, you contend that probably did not happen.
Well, there's that, but one of the things that Naylor does, before we look at what I have to say, let's let him give voice to the people who were there. And he does give voice to Pete Labor, that Delta Force commander, who thinks that air assaulting and the use of aircraft the way they envisioned for the plan was, well, predictable. And it was so predictable that enemies, to include the Taliban and Al-Qaeda reps that were there in the valley, had anticipated the Americans were going to come using their flying machines. And they set up defenses to counter that. He then, because he was on the scene, realized this was going to be a problem. And the big army, as he liked to call it, those outside of special operations, were going to do the operation this way no matter what. It's how they prepared, it's how they trained, it's how they looked at the fight. In order to make sure that it was effective, he decided to fight a slightly different way, inserting small teams in to cover the landing zones. He was there really to provide some of that fire support observation. But as his guys inserted, they find they're bumping into these pre-prepared defensive positions. They are looking at those defensive positions, realizing, hey, that heavy machine gun is ideally situated to shoot at a helicopter that's about to come in and bring soldiers in. And those special operators cleared some of those weapons out before the helicopters came in. So really, only by the audacious action of that one special operations commander was the day sort of saved. It might have been a fiasco had the helicopters gone in without those ground inserted special operators who were there to provide some cover. And that really is what brings us to sort of the most contentious point from our point of view. Sitting here at the museum, at the home of U.S. Army Aviation, it is almost a bit of heresy to look at the doctrine of the air assault and question. But that's exactly what Naylor is doing here in this volume. He's giving voice to Army leaders, especially in the special operations community, especially those key leaders, such as P. Blaber, who are questioning if that's the only appropriate tool in the toolbox. And this, I would say, is a lot more of the heat than maybe where was the air support in terms of fire support. It was the reliance on the air assault as a technique. And this is something that I wish Naylor would have really discussed a little more, other than simply giving voice to the people who are offering this argument. If he was able to discuss it, and if he was able to say, look, we need to pay attention to this argument because not everyone in the Army agrees with this. There are people who are heavily invested in the air assault. And then even in this own operation, he can show you where there were special operations community members who are like, wait, this is the way we always go. We need to get there now. So we need to go drop down right on the top of the mountain. Even though people Blaber's like, that's foolhardy. Why would we do that? So, you know, Naylor sets this up. And I think that he misses something that he could have done. And that is talk about the Army's focus on the air assault and how it becomes the sort of tactic of choice. And because it's been the tactic of choice since it's first demonstrated LCX-ray in 1965, it can be planned against. And the nation's enemies who are coming up with a defense can realize that, hey, we don't have the technology, they might say, but we can anticipate how we might be attacked, come up with non-technological solutions to prevent being simply overrun. So while those Rakistan leaders are believing that they're going to achieve a psychological impact, maybe out of place with what the insertion method might really offer, I think they're kind of mistaken. Those Al-Qaeda and Taliban opponents, they weren't ignorant of U.S. Army history. They knew the Army was going to insert those guys that way, and they had taken steps to fight against that. But in the defense of those Army leaders, it's not simply a matter of this is how they've been trained, this is something they were, attached to, or anything along those lines. I think that maybe they were realizing that the American public, the public they defended, they served, had come to expect these results. So one of the things the air assault offers is very fast results. Troops are there instantaneously. They're engaged at the decisive point almost immediately, and the action can be decided very quickly. There is no wondering when will they get there. There is no deciding, hey, have we bumped into all of the enemy yet? What's going on? No, it happens immediately. And I think Americans have become conditioned to that.
Agreed.
Look at the forces on the ground. Some aviation assets, some special operations assets, and some of those guys from the 101st. These are the people and the machines that Americans ask to provide immediate results that are decisive on the battlefield. So that's exactly what the Rakistans are trying to do. Find a plan that offered immediate results and that would be decisive on that battlefield. What Blaber says, and Naylor, I think, highlights very well in this volume, is that has become predictable. And maybe it's a bit dangerous now because of its predictability. So this is why we wanted to look at this book here in our book club. As Army aviation history is full of these air assaults that are most of the time very successful. Well, today we have to look at this doctrine and assess it. And I think Naylor does that fairly well for us in outline.
I think so. And I think it's more important oftentimes to look at what didn't work, such as Operation Anaconda here. And hopefully to take that and inculcate that so that when we make mistakes, because we all will, when we make mistakes, they're entirely original mistakes. They're not rehashing something that's been through this time and time again. And I think that's really the highlight of what you're getting at, Billy, is that oftentimes leaders, soldiers are going into combat really without training in their own history, without really learning and knowing that. Maybe they would have made the same decision, but maybe they would have made a slightly different decision. And counterfactuals aside, the point that is being made from this work is that there is a very large disparity of what the American forces can do when you have aircraft in the skies above them and when you don't. And those aircraft are not all made the same. Unfortunate as it may be, many aircraft may do the close air support or tactical air support mission, but they all have their own sets of limitations. So substituting, say, as Naylor points out, a AC-130 with an F-15 Eagle, these are not the same. They're very, very far from being the same thing, with the same sort of capacity to support those on the ground. And really, that becomes the kind of leading edge issue of what Army aviation is there to do, right? It is there to support the guy on the ground every day. That's it. The only reason it exists. So perhaps that feeling that the Air Force flew away from the Army may not still yet be resolved as a reality.
Whatever the reality of it is, I think one of the things that Naylor does very well is highlight the differences that exist in a joint environment, inter-service friction. Okay, it's not really a rivalry so much, although there are elements of rivalry. He highlights the rivalry between U.S. Army Special Operations Command and the U.S. Navy Special Operations Command, particularly at the highest levels and highest levels of proficiency. Okay, those guys are more than good-naturedly trying to compete with each other for success in high-profile or very important missions. They are sometimes a little more ragged in their conflict between them. But he does highlight that the different services have different cultures. They communicate different ways, and sometimes those different ways of communicating lead to miscommunications that could be a bit of a problem. And he shows sometimes what these battlefield problems are like. And I think he really highlights that well. But that leads me to a criticism. He is, well, very scathing in his treatment of U.S. Navy Special Operations. And you don't get much of a sense of their voice in this. You get a lot of the voice from the Army.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's even a fair number of voice actions from the United States Air Force.
Yeah.
What you don't get, heck, even some of our foreign partners got a voice in this time or two. But what you don't get really is that of the Navy. And it is understandably a very different culture, right? If you're focusing on open seas and littoral combat, that's a very different mindset than continual and sustained land-based operations.
Right.
Both have a very important place and a part to play in this, but perhaps Naylor is bringing out a point. An earlier author we read talked about how great everything had gotten after Vietnam, that everything had moved to the jointness, that was the real powerhouse of the United States military in the post-Vietnam era.
Right.
But maybe we've gotten away from that, or maybe jointness really isn't that magic button solution.
All right. Yeah, this becomes another contentious point, right? Naylor's talking about where's the air support, but he also highlights other things like, hey, is the air assault the only technique that works? What does our joint environment look like? As Army doctrine shifts to fighting in a multi-domain operating environment, as they're looking at sharing effects across different domains, such as cyber or the air or space, how does it look? And what does the reliance on joint partnerships mean? And really, Naylor's showing that in this operation, there were some questions that needed to be answered. There were some different cultural sort of upbringing that had to be addressed. Specifically talks about things such as an Air Force Special Operations General who has a great deal of experience on the Air Force Special Operations side,
Absolutely.
which is one kind of special operations, taking overall charge of a formation made up of ground-based special operations guys who have a different way of fighting. They do things different. It really, I think, underscores some of this joint discussion.
Right.
And Naylor lets us question all this stuff. We get to see it from one point of view. But I mean, this also kind of brings up another criticism. Okay, at one time, at one place, at one point, there was a bit of a problem.
Right.
Well, what was that problem? Was it a missed call? He does allude to some personality conflicts.
Absolutely.
Hey, this general didn't like that general. Those things happen. Okay, but was it more than that? Is it systemic? Or was it simply a matter of somebody missed a call that day and the different standard operating procedures, the different cultures then began driving away from each other? And because there wasn't that one call to make sure it was lashed up, it all just fell apart. Well, that's Clausewitzian friction. That's,
Right.
that is a one-time thing. And the system might be fine. And the thing that works in the system to make it effective just broke down at one little tiny moment. And it made everything just go a little askew. Well, I mean, is it more than that? Is there something we should really question here? Is there something that should be retrained, refocused on, doctrinal shifts? What's required? Naylor's not addressing it. To be fair, he's a journalist, he's covering this, simply saying, this is what I saw, or this is what the guys I interviewed saw. Okay. But that's also one of the substantive differences in historical work.
Right.
Is a historian might offer, hey, I don't think this is a one-time thing. I think this is part of the system that's, maybe in need of review. And the historian, by offering that, could maybe offer other examples. Hey, I know we're focused on operation conduct, but as it turns out, this was a problem that had reared its head in a previous operation, maybe Gothic Serpent.
Right.
Okay, or something the Army would see again in Iraq 3 years later. Just as an aside, maybe even in like a footnote, but just giving the reader a sense of, you know what? This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't just two guys didn't like each other and they just happened to find themselves in charge of that organization that day. It was something more systemic. You don't get a sense of that from it.
You don't. No, you don't. But we chose to read this book specifically for those reasons, right? Specifically to get that day one sort of gritty feel.
Yeah.
The book we're reading for our next book carries on with the theme that we've established here about Afghanistan, but is a very different operation. We're going to read the final flight of Extortion 17. Extortion 17 is a clear-cut case of everybody in that command doing absolutely all the right things, and a bad thing still happens.
Right.
So in many ways, it really underscores the entire idea of Army aviation, that there are no dry runs. You can't pull over to a cloud and hope that things don't go bump in the night, right? So every time is a live fire exercise. But we look forward to seeing you next time. Billy, any closing comments?
Well, yeah, I want to kick it over to our producer, see if there's anybody on live with us right now who has a question. Anybody who might want to further discuss this. Looking over there, she's monitoring our phone bank. She's checking all the emails. It's waiting for all the comments to go on YouTube there. We're not seeing any at the moment, or maybe the system's so backed up, none of the calls can get through.
I figure that's it. It's really,
Yeah.
it's pure chaos over there. Cats and dogs are living together.
Right,
You would not
exactly.
believe
She's
it's-
clearly swamped, but it looks like we don't have any questions to field right now. Typically, when we're doing these things live, we like to entertain a couple of questions. People who might be concerned with our treatment of the author, what they
Absolutely.
offer. What we're looking to do is not pick at scabs, but we want to highlight areas where there's room for discussion. We're not questioning what someone saw or how they felt on the battlefield. We're looking at what lessons we can learn from this. And so sometimes that means dealing with unpleasant topics or looking at things, extend questions of orthodoxy or doctrine, or what people know to be true. Well, let's see if that is the case. So that's what we're doing here. We want to make sure that you're part of that. Want to make sure that you have a voice in this. Also, although we're looking at Extortion 17 next time, if you've got some recommendations,
Absolutely.
something you'd like to look at, something you wish those guys at the Army Aviation Center would, maybe put their eyeballs on and give their opinion about, we
We'd
can
love
do
to.
so. Yeah. Again, let me remind you, we're doing this in a private capacity. We are not representing the government in any way. We don't want you to conflate our opinions with official DoD policy or anything along those lines. We're simply a couple of guys who read some history books, got some experience in this, and we want to share that. We want to highlight these contentious issues because we think that's how everyone gets better. By looking at these things, potentially coming up with answers,
Right.
or at least identifying the problems so that they can begin contemplating solutions.
Absolutely.
With that, I think that brings us to the conclusion of this month's book club. We look forward to seeing you next month, where we'll talk about the last flight of extortion Rule 7. And maybe we'll outline some of the things we have for the future when we see you next month right here at the Army Aviation Museum